Give me liberty or give me death. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Ask not what your country can do for you.
77 years ago,
America was built on courage, on imagination. The American flag is the most recognized symbol of freedom and democracy in the world.
Small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I want you to take a moment and think about where the world stood in December of 1940. France had fallen, Britain stands largely alone, bleeding, her cities have been smoking from the Blitzkrieg, Nazi Germany controls the European continent from the Norwegian coast to the Saharan edge, Japan is devouring Asia. The Axis powers have signed a mutual defense pact, 3 empires aligned, armed, and moving. And in Washington, D.C. on the night of December 29th, 1940, a man in a wheelchair wheels himself to a microphone in the Oval Office. He speaks plainly to the American people.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
Now, he's not yet asking Americans to send their sons and daughters to war. He is asking them for something more elemental. He is asking a nation of mechanics, machinists, auto workers, farmers, and entrepreneurs to understand, truly understand, that the work of their hands would decide the fate of the world. He told his listeners, powerful enemies must be outfought and outproduced. Outproduced. That single word was the entire strategy. Now, the Axis powers did not take American production seriously, and that, you see, was their most consequential miscalculation. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring said publicly that Americans could only make refrigerators and razor blades. They would never produce the military equipment necessary to defeat Nazi Germany. They were right to be afraid, just not for the right reason. In 1938, 3 years before Pearl Harbor, and you have to remember, the United States already had a national income nearly double that of the combined incomes of Germany, Japan, and Italy. American coal production was nearly double that of Germany's. What the Axis misread wasn't capacity, it was will. And here's something worth pausing on. The Great Depression had slowed the American economy. Of course it had, but it had done something paradoxical in the process. It left behind a vast reserve of idle equipment, unused factories, and tens of millions of Americans who were hungry for work and very skilled at it. When the moment came, and it did come, the reserve would prove to be the most consequential stockpile in the entire history of warfare. When Roosevelt decided to activate the arsenal, he didn't convene a committee of government planners. He called businessmen. William Knudsen was the president of General Motors, arguably the finest mass production executive in the country, a Danish immigrant who had learned manufacturing from the ground up. Roosevelt recruited him to leave the private sector and organize the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. And I want you to linger on that for a moment, because this is not a small point. The decision to put a private sector manufacturing man at the center of the effort, not a bureaucrat, not a general, was in itself philosophical. America would fight this war the way it had always built its economy, through competition, expertise, and private ingenuity, guided with a national purpose. Knudsen lobbied for tax incentives and advance payments that would allow companies to retool production lines at speed. Within months, he had arranged 920 contracts, from airplanes down to mosquito nets. Now consider Chrysler's president, K.T. Keller. He was asked by the government if his company could make tanks. He said yes, and then asked, where can I see one? He had never built a tank. He built them anyway. The Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, designed and operated by Chrysler, was the first mass production tank plant in the United States. The contract was signed in 1940. The plant wasn't even finished when the first M3 tank rolled off the line. By war's end, the Detroit Arsenal had produced a quarter of the 89,568 tanks built in America during the entire conflict. Then there was Charles Sorensen. Sorensen was Ford's vice president of production. In 1940, the Roosevelt administration asked Ford to manufacture components for the B-24 Liberator. Sorensen flew out to observe the operation at Consolidated Aircraft Depot in San Diego. And what he found there were skilled craftsmen building aircraft one at a time like a custom-designed workshop. He returned to Dearborn and told his team at Ford that they weren't going to make components. Ford was going to make the complete aircraft itself and move it on the assembly line. Now think about what that actually meant. He broke the B-24 Liberator down into one of the most complex machines ever built up to that point, with hundreds of thousands of moving parts into 11 major assembly lines and 69 sub-assemblies, and then he designed a factory to match. The site was a farmland near a creek called Willow Run, 30 miles west of Detroit. The main building ran more than a mile long. Because a county line ran through the property and local zoning wouldn't allow the line to be straight, Sorensen and architect Albert Kahn engineered a massive L-shaped turn at the end. Bombers on a moving line turned a corner inside the factory. Sorensen's boast, one finished B-24 Liberator every hour. In April 1944, workers on 2 9-hour shifts produced 453 airplanes in 468 hours. One finished B-24 every 63 minutes. Sorensen's boast was no longer a boast, and Ford still found ways to improve. This is the part that really illustrates what we're talking about. Consolidated Aircraft's method of building the B-24 center wing section required 250 man-hours. Ford's engineers redesigned the process. 1 man-hour per wing section, a 99.6% reduction in labor. That is not wartime production managed from above. That is the free market of ideas applied to manufacturing under existential stakes. While Ford was bending the laws of aircraft manufacturing, another American was bending the laws of shipbuilding. Henry Kaiser had built dams, the Hoover, the Bonneville, and the Grand Coulee. Now the government needed ships faster than ships could ever be built. The U-boat campaign was sinking the Allied cargo vessels faster than they could be replaced, and the math was not favorable. Kaiser applied everything he knew about large-scale construction to the problem. His Liberty ships were not built by skilled shipwrights using rivets and custom fittings, but by ordinary Americans trained in a week, using arc welders and prefabricated sections assembled from the dry dock and then joined at the water's edge. The first Liberty ships required around 250 days to build. By end of 1943, Kaiser's yards had driven that number down to 50 days. Then the yards started competing against each other, and this, you see, is American genius at work. The Oregon Yard built a Liberty ship in 23 days. Richmond answered with 21 days. Oregon came back with 13 days. Richmond's final answer, 7 days. The absolute speed record was the SS Robert E. Perry, launched just 4 days and 15.5 hours after her keel was laid. The Maritime Commission had to order them to stop the stunt ships, but the point had been made. By end of war, American shipyards had built 2,710 Liberty ships, an average of 3 ships every 2 days. At the war's peak, the United States was briefly responsible for approximately 90% of the worldwide shipbuilding output. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, American industry had built more than 96,000 bombers, 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 6.5 million rifles, and more than 300,000 total aircraft. The United States devoted more than 36% of its estimated GDP to the production of war goods. Aircraft production alone employed 2 million workers and produced over 125,000 aircraft. Remember what Göring had said: Americans could only make refrigerators and razor blades. In other words, he had looked at the most productive industrial nation in the world and seen a consumer economy where he should have seen a latent weapons system. America made the sky impossible to fly through if you were fighting against her. Now, these numbers don't belong to government. They never have. They belong to people. And it's worth being precise about those people and who they actually were. More than 6 million women entered the American workforce during the war years, moving from clerical and domestic jobs into factories, shipyards, and heavy manufacturing. They welded, they operated machines, they shoveled sand at steel foundries. At many plants, they earned the same wages as men for the same work. Total American industrial production had doubled between 1939 and 1945. African American workers also forced their way into this story, and I use that phrase deliberately, because they had to force their way in. Initially locked out, a pre-war survey found half of defense contractors would not hire black workers for any job. Civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph threatened a march on Washington. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, banning racial discrimination in federally contracted defense industries. It wasn't perfect, but millions of black Americans stepped into defense work anyway, claiming a piece of the war effort that had been deliberately withheld from them, building a case, rivet by rivet, weld by weld, for the rights their country still owed them. The arsenal of democracy was not built by one kind of American. It was built by all of them. Producing the war material was only the first problem. Getting it to the soldiers who needed it, across an ocean and then hundreds of miles of French war-torn countryside, was the second. And in the summer of 1944, the second problem nearly lost the war. General George S. Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1st, 1944, and within days had done something that genuinely stunned Allied commanders. It had begun moving faster than anyone had planned. The Third Army had reached the phase lines that had been projected for April of 1945, 9 months early. And then, on August 31st, 1944, the Third Army ran out of fuel, not because production had failed, but because transport was needed. The logistics chain had not been designed for this speed. The answer was trucks, and the men who drove them. On August 21st, 1944, the Red Ball Express began rolling. The name came from the old American railroad tradition of red dots marking priority freight, the fast trains, the ones that don't stop. More than 6,000 trucks ran one-way roads designed exclusively for the convoys, rolling from the port of Cherbourg to the supply dumps near Chartres in 54-hour round trips. An average of 900 vehicles were on the road at any given moment. Most drivers were under 24. Few had commercial truck driving experience before the war. 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American servicemen. In the segregated Army of 1944, largely barred from combat command, they took their assignment and turned it into one of the most critical operations of the European campaign. For 82 days, they delivered an estimated 12,000 tons of supplies per day. By the time the Red Ball Express was discontinued, when the port of Antwerp was finally opened, its drivers had transported more than 412,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and equipment to 28 different Allied divisions. Time magazine called it the miracle of supply, describing it as being, in the American tradition, a tradition the Germans never fully understood. It was born from a people accustomed to great spaces, to transcontinental railways, and to nationwide trucking chains. They kept the freight moving. Now here's what I want you to take away from all of this. The arsenal of democracy was not directed from above. It was summoned from below. Knudsen was a businessman. Kaiser was a dam builder. Sorensen was a production engineer. The Rosies were workers who needed wages. The Red Ball drivers were soldiers who had been told to drive trucks and decided to drive them as fast as God and the engine would take them. Roosevelt's government provided the contracts, the tax incentives, and the urgent national purpose. American private industry and American workers did the rest. 250 years into this American experiment, we are still that nation. Still the one that converts ingenuity into capability. That takes a crisis and finds in it the engine of a new order. We field the best equipped fighting force in the world because generations of American workers and engineers decided that good enough was never going to be good enough. I like to think the same of Spartan Forge, and that we're part of that lineage. The gear that we build begins with the same conviction that American manufacturing excellence is not a tradition to preserve, it's a gold standard to be upheld. The arsenal of democracy was real, it worked, and it still demands to be honored, not in museums, but in the quality of what American hands build every day.